Hi everyone, my name is Lingshu Chenyang, Associate Professor here at the College of Law. I want to welcome everyone joining us in person and online on behalf of the Stegner Center at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and the Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. I also wanted to remind everyone about the exciting upcoming events at the Stegner Center. Next Thursday, we are welcoming Professor Vanessa Casado-Perez from Texas A&M University to our 18th annual Stegner Center Young Scholars Lecture to talk about water markets. The following Thursday, we'll be welcoming Professor John Leshy from UC Hastings to our Stegner Center Green Bag to talk about his new book on the history of America's public lands. And next year, mark your calendars for March 16th through the 17th. That is when we will hold our 28th annual symposium on the future of the Great Salt Lake. For more information on these events, please see the online calendar of events on the Stegner Center's website. Okay, so on to today's Stegner Center Green Bag. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Jonathan B. Jarvis, 18th Director of the National Park Service, to discuss his new book, co-authored with his brother, Destry Jarvis, National Parks Forever, 50 Years of Fighting and a Case for Independence. John Jarvis was nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the Senate as the 18th Director of the National Park Service. He served for the entire Obama administration from 2009 to 2017. During his tenure, he led the agency through its Centennial, adding 22 new parks, including those that recognize the contributions of women and people of color, achieved its largest budget in history, addressed climate change, and raised over $400 million in philanthropic support. John served for 40 years with the National Park Service as ranger, biologist, and superintendent in national parks across the country, retiring from the National Park Service in 2017. He then became the inaugural executive director of the Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity at the University of California, Berkeley, and now serves as chairman of the board. John also serves as the chairman of the Editorial Board for the Parks Stewardship Forum, an online publication for conservation practitioners, and as a steering committee member of the California Biodiversity Network. His previous book is The Future of Conservation in America, A Chart for Rough Water from the University of Chicago Press. His current book, also from the University of Chicago Press, is, as I mentioned, National Parks Forever, 50 Years of Fighting and a Case for Independence. Co-authored with his brother Destry Jarvis, a longtime conservation advocate, the Jarvis brothers in this book detailed the politics behind the national parks and call for the National Park Service to be established as an independent agency akin to the Smithsonian Institution. John has been the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions, including the National Recreation and Park Association's Legend Award, Sierra Club's Edgar Wayburn Award and Trailblazer Award, International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Fred Packard Award, and the American Alpine Club's David R. Brower Conservation Award. So today, John will discuss with us his latest book, which details he and his brothers combined 90 years of battling the politics that would undermine the stewardship of what Wallace Stegner called America's best idea, and what, on a personal note, inspired me to become an environmental law professor. Their conclusion is that the National Park Service must be reestablished as an independent agency. So whether you're remote or joining us in person, please follow the instructions posted on the screen for the Q&A session. If you like a question another attendee has asked, please click the thumbs up icon. That'll push that question to the top of the list. The King's English Bookshop is joining us virtually to sell Director Jarvis's book. Information to order National Parks Forever is online on the websites for the Stegner Center and the King's English Bookshop. So with that, please join me in welcoming John Jarvis.
Well, thank you, and welcome everybody, both here and virtually online as well. It's a great pleasure to be here, and back in the University of Utah, I had an opportunity to come and speak once before with my previous book, and it's always a great opportunity to be back on this campus. Thank you for the acknowledgement of the indigenous owners of these lands. That's very appropriate these days, and I want to acknowledge any former Park Service in the audience. So stick up your hand, because it's great to see those of you that I worked with in the past. And I also want to acknowledge Peter and Gail Knight, good friends. And Peter served on the National Park Foundation Board and still is very active with the conservation of our parks. And also my wife, Paula, is back there in the audience. And she has been on this journey with me for more than 40 years as well. So as was mentioned, I spent 40 years with the National Park Service. So you can see that I started really early on that career path. The only thing, the mustache has gotten a little grayer over those years. But I had the opportunity to work in a whole variety of parks in a lot of different positions. And as was mentioned, I served as the 18th director under President Barack Obama, which was a lot of fun, and we were able to do a lot of great things. This book is co-authored with my brother, Destry, who we mentioned has spent his career, hold on just a sec. Our working title for this book was Inside and Outside the National Park Service. In a way, Destry served on the outside of the National Park Service, working in a variety of NGOs and advocacy roles. And in my view, was really much of an inspiration for me. He's 6 years older than I am, and led me to my career in the National Park Service. And the sort of joke of the title is that 50 years of fighting was generally between the two of us, over a variety of things, including the future of the national parks, where I would say he has a strong opinion about a lot of things. So the rule is never write a book with your brother, by the way. So as all of you know, the sort of National Park Service has this sort of core mission, the Organic Act, to conserve these places for the enjoyment of future generations, to conserve them unimpaired. And this is sort of the mission statement for all National Park Service employees, for our advocacy organizations, our friends alike across the system. And over the last 100 years plus, the system has grown. We're now at 423 units of the National Park System, kind of a unfortunate term that we use a lot of. 63 of them carry the title of National Park, but all of them are managed under this core mission and stewardship responsibility to protect these places for future generations. And even this concept of national parks, which has spread around the world, there are literally hundreds of nations today that have national park systems. They all have this sort of common set of values, that they're really there to conserve the scenery and the natural and history, to conserve the plants and animals, and to invite the public to come see these places. That's a little bit unique in a way. They are not really set aside and without an expectation and a responsibility to allow the public come and enjoy them at the same time. And that they are also to be stewarded in such a way that they are still unimpaired for future generations. And that sort of becomes kind of the core value set that we deal with. Certainly here in Utah, you have some extraordinary national parks and great examples of this amazing national park system. And I was here in May with some old friends and taking them around these these amazing places here in Utah with their extraordinary beauty and complexity as well. But all of this is within the context of the politics of Washington. And this is a place that I have worked. My brother has spent his entire career there. And so we really wanted to sort of present the challenges that really come from an agency, a federal agency that has this mission stewardship responsibility and yet is subject to this political morass of Washington, D.C. So occasionally I'm going to read from the book. In this book, we each tell our stories separately and then reach conclusions on each issue together. Destry's career has been primarily that of a parks advocate, policy wonk, lobbying, suing, and publicly supporting or chastising the National Park Service and its political controllers as warranted. In contrast, my career has been that of a professional ranger, field park manager, as well as agency director, making challenging decisions based on science and adherence to policy, pushing back against political appointees who do not support the mission of the National Park Service. And our overall conclusion that the NPS should be an independent agency has broad implications for the future of the National Park System that we hope will inspire all Americans. And we start with our premise. It is high time for a fundamental change in how the National Park Service is allowed to steward our American National Park System by moving the NPS out of the highly conflicted and overly politicized Department of the Interior. Instead, it should be made an independent agency by act of Congress, perhaps structured like the Smithsonian Institution or the National Archives and Records Administration. Our book will make this case built upon more than 90 years of combined park experience. So I'm going to start with a story. I like to tell stories. So this is me as the superintendent of Mount Rainier National Park with Secretary of Interior Gail Norton. So Gail Norton came in the George W. Bush administration. She was a protege of the previous Secretary of Interior, Jim Watt. And when George W. Bush was getting ready to run for his second term, Secretary Norton came up to the Northwest to sort of promote his campaign and his promises for the American people as the president for his second term. And she asked me to go with her, to travel with her around the Northwest. And this is the Seattle environs. And we were going to stop by pretty much all the major media outlets as a part of this. And, I'm a career National Park Service employee. I can't politic or lobby for anybody, but I can be there to answer questions. And I traveled with her in uniform, and we went from, media outlet to media outlet. And there's two stories to this. One is we went to this AM radio station run by a guy by the name of Kirby Wilbur, and he's kind of a Rush Limbaugh conservative AM guy. And we go in and he's like, Secretary Norton, we love you. You're in Bush territory. We know you're surrounded here in Seattle by all these greenies, but here you're safe. And then he looks at me and he goes, who's this guy? And she said, well, this is John Jarvis. He works for the National Park Service. And he goes, National Park Service? He said, I love the National Park Service. And then he just riffs. He's a Civil War buff, and he loves to take kids out to the battlefields in the East and just, expounded on how great the system is. And we sort of heard this over and over again every place we went. So at the end of the 3 or 4 days that I'm with the secretary, we're sitting in the back of her car, we're headed to the airport, and I turned to her and I said, so Secretary Norton, we've been hearing all these positive comments about the National Park Service. Why don't we put together a political platform for President Bush for his second term around a true investment in the national park system? And she turned and looked at me and she pointed her finger at me and she said, you know the trouble with you people? You cost me $17 an acre and the BLM is $3 an acre. And I looked at her and I said, in all due respect, the Statue of Liberty is not a $3 an acre property. she never spoke to me again. So it was just kind of, an example of the way the Park Service is viewed by not every administration, but some administrations, and what we sort of have to deal with in those areas. So the Park Service is a bureau in the Department of Interior. And there are many bureaus. I like to say that the Department of Interior is an aggregate of bureaus with inherently conflicting mandates. And that we spend a lot of our time sort of fighting with each other. But also over the last 50 years, and we talk about this in the book, that there have been increasing layers imposed layer upon layer upon layer between the National Park Service and the Secretary of Interior. And for me, when I was director, between me and the secretary, there was a deputy assistant secretary, there was an assistant secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, there was an assistant secretary for policy management budget. Every one of those had a deputy and a chief of staff. Then there was the chief of public affairs, the deputy secretary, and the chief of staff to the secretary. And for me to get a basic policy question up to the secretary, that was a gauntlet. There was at least 9 layers that it would go through to get all the way up to the top. And so most ideas or even an emphasis on the future of the park system sort of died along that gauntlet line. And one of the very clear sort of outcomes of that process is the budget. And as those of you who follow the park system, the budget has been pretty much static, flat, and underfunded for many, many, many years. And part of it is because the Park Service is sort of kept within that frame of the Department of Interior. And you can see across the appropriations line, it hovers a little bit up and down a little bit, regardless of what's going on out there in terms of stewardship or visitation or any of the other issues. So an enormous challenge. And then periodically, we get an administration that comes in that just wants to whack the budget of the National Park Service and knock off 10, 15, 20%. And they usually come up with some euphemism or some way of sort of justifying it, in this case, sequestration and or service level adjustments, which the good news, of course, a lot of this always pops up in the press about when they attempt to really cut the National Park Service's budget deeply in these kinds of challenging times for the agency. Now, the book definitely talks about the problems, but I really don't want to go away with you thinking that it's always a disaster, that there have been some pretty extraordinary accomplishments. I must say in this picture, so I'm standing here with the president, and this alligator is walking across in front of us, and I was very tempted to reach down and grab it. But if you look right behind me, there's a Secret Service guy standing right behind me. And I think he probably would have tackled me if I had tried that. But under President Obama, we had some great opportunities to do some restoration work in the Everglades. You put in the first of the 5-mile bridge that really can return water flows. We took down the Elwha dams in Olympic National Park, restoring 70 miles of riverway for anadromous fish, a project that I worked on almost 30 years. And it was mentioned in the introduction, we added new parks using the Antiquities Act. For example, the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, a place where over 600 pieces of legislation have been written specifically to give power to vote and to many equal rights amendment, many things for women. And then adding true American stories that have not really been told, such as the great work of Cesar Chavez to get protection for the farm workers of their nation as well. So, I don't want to go away at all with you thinking that it's always been bad, because there have been moments of extraordinary opportunity, but often they are also fraught with their own challenges. And so when Destry and I were talking about the book, we picked certain topics that we both knew well, but came at from slightly different perspectives. And the establishment of the lands in Alaska is one where we we both really worked together. And really, when you think back over the last 50 years, the passage of the Alaska Lands Act and the addition of lands for parks and refuges in Alaska is one of the greatest conservation movements and activities in our nation's history. And certainly Destry and I were both actively involved in that. Destry, and that's him in the front there with the hair hanging over the back of his collar in those days, which was stylish, with President Carter when he was leading the conservation movement. He was the head of the Alaska Coalition and was actively involved in hoping to get legislation ultimately to establish the protection of lands in Alaska. And so let me give you a Alaska history in a nutshell. So we bought it from Russia in 1867. It's roughly 375 million acres. It's like 3 times the size of California. Gold is discovered in 1890, so you get the gold rush. People actually start going up there. Statehood comes in 1959. In the state, the most generous offer for any state to come into the statehood, the state could select 100 million acres, basically a third of the state for itself for future development, roughly selecting the size of the state of California for its own. Oil is discovered in 1968 in Prudhoe Bay. And this triggered a whole series of things. Now you got to get oil out. You got to get oil to the south, which means you're going to got to put a pipeline, and which means you're going to cross a lot of native lands. And the concern was that all of the Alaska natives would tax the pipeline, essentially, or prevent it from being developed. So Congress stepped forward and passed what's called the Alaska Claims Native Settlement Act of 1971, which would allow the Native Alaskans to select about 44 million acres of lands. And Senator Alan Bible of Nevada inserted what's called the D2 section in that law. And the D2 section provided the opportunity for the federal government, Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Agriculture, to select up to 80 million acres for conservation. So that D2 triggered the Conservation Coalition to be formed, probably the first and last time that all the environmental groups got together on one mission to start to figure out what that 80 million acres would look like. This was quite a fight in Congress. The delegation from Alaska strongly opposed this. And the Bush community in Alaska also wasn't too excited about the concept of the National Park Service. This is a sign that hangs right on the edge of Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in the community of Slana. And if you read in there in the middle, it says, we were here long before the National Park Service. And they anticipated respect as the parks were being established. And as I mentioned, Destry was right in the middle of a lot of these fights. And so one of his sections in the book, throughout 1969 and early into 1980, direct lobbying in the Senate by the Alaska Coalition members, including myself, often accompanied by influential board members from the coalition organizations, intensified in an effort to sway votes. One of my most memorable lobby days was escorting an NPCA board member, that's the National Parks Conservation Association, Mrs. W.L. Lyons, actually Sally Brown, to see her home state senator, Wendell Ford, a member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where markup of the bill was occurring. Senator Ford was hesitant to support the coalition's strengthening amendments, preferring the chair of Scoop Jackson's middle ground compromises. At one point in the tense meeting, Sally shook her finger in the senator's face and said, "My family controls 1/5 of the economy of Kentucky. You will do as I say." Senator Ford thereupon supported most of the coalition's amendments, and ultimately it prevailed. Sally Brown owned Jack Daniel's distillery. So Jack Daniels had a huge influence on the establishment of the parks in Alaska. So ultimately, ANILCA was passed and the park units were established in Alaska. About 44 million acres came to the national park system across Alaska. And I had the opportunity early on to go up and be a ranger in Kotzebue. But Paula, my wife, said, make sure you write because I'm not coming with you. And so we didn't go then, but later on, I ultimately convinced her to go to Alaska, and we went up, and I served as the superintendent of Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve for 5 years with our family there living in the bush. And in spite of all the sort of crazy, complications in the legislation, managing it on the ground under the expectations of the environmental community, the expectations of the legislature, the members of Congress, and the local communities was complicated. And I can give you a great example of, so in the passage of ANILCA, local rural residents had the right for subsistence within the parks. That basically they could hunt and fish in the parks. And ultimately, there was a challenge in the court system that forced a federal takeover of subsistence. And so in the book I wrote, with the federal takeover of subsistence, which was intended by the state, what was intended by the state was not possible, and what was intended by the conservation community was also not possible. And the rangers in the field were left to figure it out on the ground, and I had to explain it to the locals. As I told many of my staff in future assignments, unless you have stood in front of a public meeting in an Alaskan bar, which is often the only place you could meet, where most of the crowd is drunk and armed, and you have to deliver a message they really don't want to hear, you've really never done a true public meeting. I have to admit that I was never really afraid and actually enjoyed these rather raucous gatherings. And at one point, a guy said, a few years ago, I would have kicked your ass, but this time I'm going to buy you a beer. We had to figure it out, and basically we did. But politics continues to play a role, and one of the issues, of course, is hunting and how hunting is carried out. And the state of Alaska issued a rule while I was director that would allow hunters to kill a female bear in the den over her cubs, which I felt was a highly unsportsmanlike, shall we say, way of hunting. And so because the preserves in Alaska are technically subject to state regulations, automatically the preserves were open to this kind of take. And so I issued with my team a regulation that shut that down, so that no one could actually do that kind of hunting within the national park units as well. And then the Trump administration came in and reversed that and reopened the preserves to the take of female bears and the cub, and that just was shot down by the courts. So the courts just in the last month, you'll see that's October 9, reversed that ruling again. That puts the old rule back into place as well. So after Alaska, I came back to the lower 48, back to Mount Rainier National Park. And this was, as I mentioned when I showed the picture with me with Gail Norton, we were back in the George W. Bush administration. And one of their big initiatives was something called competitive sourcing. And competitive sourcing was the idea that anything that the federal government does could be done better by the private sector. And so At 10,000 feet on the side of Mount Rainier is Camp Muir. And this is the staging area for climbers that are going to make a summit bid. And we have a toilet at Camp Muir, obviously. And the political appointees at the Department of Interior came to Mount Rainier. And so they came to my office, and they suggested that we hire a contractor to clean this toilet rather than cleaning it ourselves as a part of our duties. And I said, well, I'd never seen a Yellow Page ad for a toilet service company that was capable of servicing a toilet at 10,000 feet on the mountain with staff that were helicopter load certified, willingness to sleep multiple nights in a tent on snow, and could assist in frequent mountain rescues. They were fit enough to summit the mountain themselves, self-arrest in a free fall, have emergency medical training, and survive in a winter storm. And they basically said, well, then what else you got that we can give to the private sector? But it was just this sort of misunderstanding of what the parks really are about and how the teams work that they were thinking about turning it over to the private sector. So from 2002 to 2009, before I went to Washington, I was the regional director for the National Park Service in the Pacific, and I was dealing with a barrage of ideas that came out of the administration. They wanted to propose carving Ronald Reagan's face onto the front of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. Secretary Norton banned park rangers from talking in school groups. They considered education as quote unquote mission creep. There were members of Congress that were proposing a park closure commission. Any parks that didn't have a certain number of visitors really didn't deserve to exist. There was attempts to turn Channel Islands National Park into a private hunting reserve. And there was an assertion by a political appointee that the impairment standard actually didn't apply to conservation, it applied to enjoyment. And that you can't impair the public's enjoyment of the national parks. And the idea being therefore that the public could do pretty much whatever they wanted to do in a national park as long as they were having a good time. And we found this to be quite a problem. And in the process, they began to rewrite our own policies. So this is the Management Policies Notebook, which is really the sort of core Bible guide of the national parks of how you implement the Organic Act. And they attempted to rewrite this and frankly didn't get away with it because a number of us fought back, including many of our advocacy organizations like NPCA and my brother as well. And it's a long, complicated story that we tell in the book. The other thing we wanted to talk about in this book, we have a chapter on, is the role of science. And for those of you who know a little of the park history, really the beginning of science started with this young man, George Melendez Wright, who was a student at the University of California, Berkeley. He began the surveys of the national parks flora and fauna, and he wound up standing up his own biological division at Berkeley for the Park Service with his own money. Park Service didn't give him any money, so he had to do it. And fortunately, he was independently wealthy. You jump forward, you got Starker Leopold, son of Aldo Leopold, who really created the framework with the Leopold Report in 1963 about how parks were to be managed. And of course, in those days, they weren't thinking about challenges like climate change. And of course, now we know that the parks are significantly impacted by climate change. A warming planet is warming the parks actually more quickly than the surrounding lands. And if you know your sort of locations of parks, that doesn't surprise me. We're often in extreme environments, deserts, high elevation, Alaska and other places. So So technically the parks are getting warmer even faster than other parts of the country. And so when I was director, we launched this climate change strategy to sort of get ahead of this and put in place a number of policies and plans for parks to adapt to climate change. And we tasked the National Park System Advisory Board to revisit the Leopold report. Because take the concepts that Starker Leopold put forward about how to manage parks unimpaired, but bring in the attitude of climate change and the impacts we're seeing today. And it really set up a new frame for the National Park Service to move forward. And then we took that policy, or took that set of recommendations and converted it into policy so that parks could actually have a policy framework to respond to climate change. And in 2016, I issued Director's Order 100, which was the guidance for all the national parks. And then in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded that order and removed it from our policy guidance. And my science advisor, Dr. Gary Machlis, was quoted in the press as an act of willful ignorance on the part of the administration. And so parks were left without any clear guidance of how to respond to the challenges that they're facing right now in terms of climate change as well. Gary and I also documented over 100 rollbacks of environmental regulations, policies, and science around the environment, not just for the National Park Service, but for the protection of all of our air and water during the Trump administration in particular. Was a very dark period for the environment. And the parks certainly did not avoid that as well. And then as sort of the final stroke, as we begin to sort of think about parks as a part of a larger ecosystem, park superintendents were basically told to stay in their boundaries. And then in the case like in Yellowstone, the superintendent was basically removed by the Trump administration and setting the park back for many years as well. So I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity for some questions, but I want to get to the bottom line here. I want to read you just a last part of our book. Imagine for a moment that every 4 years there was a political purge of the top leadership of the Smithsonian, and a fresh group of political leaders arrived with new ideas for this venerable and respected institution. Career museum directors would be shuffled around randomly to see which ones would retire. Scientists would be threatened and silenced if they wrote or spoke about anything the new leadership did not like or believe. Natural History Museum exhibits would be presented with information that had climate change, extinction, or evolution would be covered up or removed for remodeling. At the African American History Museum of History and Culture, the civil rights exhibits would show fire hoses, and attack dogs being unleashed on peaceful citizens would now declare there were good people on both sides. Plans would be formulated and aired to turn the museums over to the private sector, and business executives from amusement parks would be invited to suggest ways to monetize the institution, including entrance fees, private rentals, selling of artifacts, and naming rights. And at the Air and Space Museum, new exhibits would present alternative facts about the 1969 moon landing. This sounds horrifying. This is the situation that faces the National Park Service every 4 to 8 years. So our conclusion is that the Park Service needs to be stood up as an independent agency separated from the Department of Interior. That doesn't separate it from politics. Certainly the Smithsonian has its own challenges with politics as well. But the bottom line is, in order to achieve this long-term core mission, that these places are preserved unimpaired for future generations, the agency needs to be at least freed from this whipsaw that happens every 4 to 8 years, with a change in administration. We believe that these values, these places are too valuable to all of you, the entire American people, if not the world, to be treated in such a manner on a recurring basis as well. So that's my story and our book. I hope you pick it up and have an opportunity to read about it and think about it. And at some point in the future, there might actually be some congressional action on this kind of thing, and something that we can hopefully get all behind. So I'll stop there and open it up to any questions that you might have. And I think there's a way for those of you online to pose questions, and we also from the audience as well. Right here. Yes, sir.
Any national park monument considerations on the horizon?
I'm sort of not in that loop, but I think there's always a working list of potentials out there for new park units. The question was, are there any new parks or new monuments in the works? I mean, if you look back over the history, the last 100 years of park superintendent, of presidents and the use of the Antiquities Acts, the only presidents that have never used the Antiquities Act were Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and H.W. Bush. Every other president has used the Antiquities Act to establish new units of the national park system. And so I would anticipate that would continue. And Congress is always interested in adding new units to the system as well. So, history hasn't stopped. So there's opportunities to tell a more complete story of America through some of these places. So, I hope there are places that we would add to the system into the future.
To the other end of that question, you've got 420 plus units now. Did you and your brother discuss if there should be a reduction in the number of MPS units, understanding that those being transferred would go to another organization, local, state, or federal, or private, that would maybe be able to handle some of those smaller issues? And the background, from my point of view, is that there's state parks across the country that should probably be in the national park system if you were doing it all at once.
Right.
There's probably national park units that should not be in the national parks. And did you discuss the implications and the consequences of some reevaluation of some of those units currently in MPS?
We certainly, over the years, my brother and I probably had that conversation, 50 times about that. I think our general conclusion, though, that I would say he would agree with me on this, is that, a park unit comes into the system either by an act of Congress or an executive powers of the president. And once in, we learn to love it. I will say, though, the future of the system is really much more about partnerships and partnership parks, where we look at a park as a subcomponent of a much larger landscape, a larger story, a larger ecosystem, often in partnership with state parks that have a piece. And when we combine our resources, our staffs, our friends groups, and often even our budgets, we can accomplish a whole lot more than either one of us can accomplish individually. And we've got a lot of really great partnership parks out there with state parks, as I'm sure you're aware, but even with private land trusts and conservation trusts and private organizations and ranchers and others. And I think that to me is really the future of how you deal with it. I do believe, the Park Service's budget is about $3 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. That's the budget of the city of Austin, Texas. So when you put that in the context of It's a relatively moderate-sized city budget that you run, 423 parks and, and host 320 million visitors a year. 320 million visitors is more visitors than all of Disney, National Football, National Basketball, National Baseball, NASCAR, and soccer combined. And so basically the budget is a paltry budget for the expectation of that kind of stewardship. And we've called upon Congress, and it goes back to the point of Department of Interior gets an allocation, and they have to divide that up between the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Office of Surface Mining, and the Bureau of Reclamation, and all these other agencies that need money too. And so the Park Service winds up really not getting the resources that it needs or deserves. Right here.
Professional advocates for making the national parks independent. What does that process look like?
Yeah, the question was about advocates within Congress. There are certainly members of Congress that would be open to and amenable to this idea. They've done things like this. I mean, you could make the argument that the Presidio Trust is an independent federal agency that manages the extraordinary lands within Golden Gate and around San Francisco, is an independent federal agency. But we have not gone to that step yet. We're sort of in the process of getting the idea out there. It's not a new idea. There have been discussions of independence that go back to the days of Bruce Vento, who was a great park advocate on the Hill, and others. But that's something that, we're going to wait and see what happens with the midterms, and then, think about our opportunities in the next few years to build that kind of constituency on the Hill. We'll go here and then here. Go ahead.
The reactionary state of Utah nevertheless promotes the Mighty Five parks in Utah.
They do.
And I think they should make it the Great Eight. What do you think?
Well, the Mighty Five is considered one of the most successful or challenging marketing things in recent years, because it definitely promoted the Utah parks, which now they're overwhelmed. And I was down there in May, and I got my timed ticket to get into Arches, which on one hand isn't all bad. When I talked to the rangers, I got outed down there, and I sort of got talked to the rangers about how it's going. They said there are no longer fist fights in the parking lots for parking spaces, so they felt it was pretty good. And certainly when I was in Zion, using the transportation system, and that helps with the challenge. But I mean, I've always been a bit frustrated with Utah's politics in that they love these incredible places that you have. You have an extraordinary national park system and public lands, yet the politics often are a little adverse to their continuation, in spite of the fact how important they are to your economy, to visitation, and to, in many ways, the value set of Utah communities. So yeah, it could be the Mighty Eight or the Mighty more than that. Yeah. Over here.
In light of what you seem to describe as the vast popularity of the parks among the population and the economic benefit that these parks provide, in addition to conservation ideas, what do you think accounts for the hostility in some administrations toward the Park Service?
The question was really about what accounts for the hostility in spite of the popularity of the. That's a good question, and I'm not sure I completely understand it. I used to, and Destry, my brother knows this really well, is that we used to say that the Capitol Hill is full of closet park supporters. When I was director, I'd go on the Hill to meet a new member of Congress. I always wanted to go up and introduce myself and say, this is who I am, this is who we are. And frequently they would be, a self-identified Tea Party, far-right conservative, anti-public lands. They had seen them in the press, beating us up. And I'd go in and they're like, oh, you're the director of the National Park Service. And staff, would you step out for a minute? And it goes, will you sign my pass? And they would pull down the shades and tell me how much they support the national parks, but they couldn't do it in public. They couldn't do it in a hearing. And they would literally say, this is going to be really ugly, and it's going to be we're going to beat the crap out of you, but just know that behind the scenes I'm completely supportive. And so a lot of it's just kabuki theater that you sort of have to deal with when you're on the Hill. The pollsters will all tell the conservatives to, support the national parks. But I think if you have a sort of a political line that the federal government should be smaller and should be, leave the public alone, sort of the last thing you want is a highly popular federal agency. And so it's sort of an antithesis, and they struggle with it. I've seen them struggle with it up there about how do we support the national parks while, getting the government small enough to drown in a bathtub, as some have suggested. And so I think, to me, the American public, who we steward these places on your behalf, need to speak up and say, we may, the 320 million visitors that came to the parks last year were not all Democrats. They were not all one party. They were people of all colors and stripes and all political persuasions that stood shoulder to shoulder in the Grand Canyon and were in awe, just like everybody else. And I think we have to convert that into something that recognizes the value of these places for all of its benefits. When I go to the Hill, depending on who I was talking to, the message might shift a little bit. So like making the economic argument, that every dollar invested in the National Park Service is $4 return to the economy. So it's not a cost, it's an investment. It's a return, and you get it in jobs, you get it in trickle down cascading through the American economy. 60 million visitors that come to the national parks every year are from foreign countries that come here. And that's, from an economic standpoint, that's new money. That's money coming into the economy and into these gateway communities that live on the existence of that kind of tourism. And so, the U.S. National Park System is held up around the world as the model, the best model, not the only model, but the best model of how to do national parks. And, you find extraordinary support for our park system when I do international work that we don't even find at home at times. So it's an interesting question and not one we've ever really figured out. Dean.
Speaking of threats to the national park system, your book has a compelling list of ways that the Trump administration has taken a cudgel to parks, policies, people. Would you care to venture, even if it's just ballpark, figure, a proportional figure of if or how many of those have been reversed since then?
I'll repeat the question. So he said that the book outlines a number of these rescissions, rollbacks, reversals by the Trump administration on environmental laws and policies. And so Dr. Gary Machlis and I, and his question was how many have been reversed? How many are back? Dr. Gary Machlis, my science advisor, and I ran a project called the Restoration Project, where we outlined 100 of these rollbacks during the Trump administration. We put together a team and evaluated, curated, and prioritized the 100 environmental reversals of the Trump administration, things like rollback on the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and the stuff they did to the Park Service, and the reversal of the National Environmental Policy Act, and just a whole range of really horrible things. Many of them are in regulation, which requires, in order to reverse them, you have to rewrite the regulation, and you got to go through the same laborious process of writing the reg, posting in the Federal Register, taking public comment, doing the NEPA analysis, and so on and so forth. A lot of them are in process right now in the Biden administration. Some were executive powers, and President Biden has reversed some of those, like the climate response. The Climate Action Bill had enough in it that reversed a number of those changes, but most of the regulatory changes that were completed have not been reversed yet. They're still in process because it takes 4 or 5 years to basically complete a federal regulation. So there's still a lot of them that are going to, and unless stopped by Congress, they will complete those within this current administration.
So we have a few questions from the online audience. So one question is, wouldn't an independent NPS as a cabinet level agency still be subject to politics every 4 years?
It is, but it's not, even at the cabinet level though, you're not subject to, and if you're buried in the Department of Interior, as I mentioned, there are basically 9 levels above the Director of the National Park Service before you get to the Secretary of Interior. And those are 9 levels that are in the organizational structure. Mixed in all of that are literally dozens and dozens of political appointees that did not go through Senate confirmation, that came from some lobbying firm or worked for the private sector or whatever, have come in and are constantly in your face over doing things in national parks. That would all be gone if you were as an independent agency. You'd still be subject to politics. I mean, the Smithsonian has a board. If they're looked at as an example, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the chairman of the board. And both the Speaker of the House and the Leader of the Senate are members of the Smithsonian's board. So it's not like you're free of politics. But if you contrast, let's just take the Trump administration. During the 4 years of the Trump administration, Lonnie Bunch became the director of the Smithsonian, highly respected, extraordinary individual, steps in, becomes the director of the Smithsonian. The Park Service, no director for 4 years. Unprecedented history, no director. Just a series of political appointees serving as the director of the National Park Service. So that's kind of how we have thought about this. You're never free from politics in Washington, but this would let's say, slim it down.
Another question along that vein, how do we solve the problem of different administrations shrinking or expanding NPS through the Antiquities Act?
Well, one is that we believe in our book that at one time, the Park Service had its own authority to go to Congress and testify either for or against a park unit. And on record, I would say the Park Service testified against new units more often than it testified for units. That we would evaluate it in a scholarly, scientific, significance, feasibility standard and say, that really doesn't fit the system. It's either not nationally significant, it's compromised, it doesn't really fit the story, it isn't worthy. And Congress would then decide, sometimes to do it anyway. Under the Department of Interior, the Park Service is not allowed to do that. The Park Service doesn't get to present its own professional opinion on whether a unit should be in or not. It goes through all of that gauntlet of filters and all the politics that come into play about new units to the National Park Service, either by Antiquities Act or by legislation. And the Park Service's professional opinion is basically suppressed or ignored. And so I think an independent agency status would allow the Park Service to present its professional opinion and analysis to say that really shouldn't be in the system and be better preserved in another way.
Another legal reform question from the audience. Given that political pressure on the National Park Service will always exist, would it help to revise the dual mandate of the 1916 Park Service Organic Act to give conservation of natural lands priority over public use?
That's an interesting question. That's an age-old debate. From a policy standpoint, the Park Service has put in place its policy that does set a priority on conservation, that it's not an equal, it's often referred to as the dual mandate, but we in the service have said that if you're going to err on the side of conservation preservation and not on the side of public use. And so maybe that's risky. I would say there have been, attempts at revising the 1916 Organic Act to do just the opposite of that. And that was one of the proposals that came during the George W. Bush administration, during the management policies period. There was a proposal to revise the Organic Act to make the priority public enjoyment. And we were fortunate to be able to fend that off. So I personally don't think we need a legislative fix to that, as long as the policies can withstand the political pressure, so that when a manager is faced with a Sophie's Choice decision, they're going to err on the side of the conservation.
Switching gears a bit, you mentioned working in Alaska. Did you compare your method of managing with that of Canada?
Yes, actually, I have long worked closely with Parks Canada and have enormous respect for them. And I do believe, particularly in their relationship with First Nations and the way that they manage their parks and the role that First Nations Canada has in direct stewardship over many of their lands is a model that we need to apply here in the United States. And we have not yet done that. There have been some attempts, but Canada, I think, has been a great pioneer, a great leader around the world in incorporation of indigenous stewardship. And it's definitely a direction that the U.S. National Park System needs to go.
Wonderful. Any other questions from our live audience?
Does the Park Service derive fees that the public pays to enter the parks?
Yeah, the question was, does the Park Service basically derive or keep the fees? Yes. The legislation, the fee legislation, allows the National Park Service to retain 100% of all the fees that it collects on a recurring basis, and it's called Know Your Money. So once we collect it, we get to keep it, and it can transition each appropriation year. The Park Service collects about $300 million a year in fees, and that's entrance, campground, and other sort of special use fees. So you're looking at less than 10% of the budget, but they do get to keep that money. Cordell.
John, what is your assessment of the Park Service's science program? How would scientists and science be?
It's a good question. He said assessment of the science program, current science in the Park Service. It's a long story, and I'm sure you, Cordell, probably knows it as well as I do about the history of science in the park system. in how at one point under Secretary Bruce Babbitt during the Clinton administration, the scientists of the National Park Service were all gathered up and transferred to a new agency, basically over to the U.S. Geological Survey. And in a stroke of a pen, we lost, I think, decades of our scientific capacity within the National Park Service, which a number of us have been working to rebuild over time. We do have a lot of PhDs in the Park Service now that have come in and work in the natural resources fields and in the history fields and have been leaders in our climate response programs and others. But I would say it's inadequate to deal with some of the complex issues that we are dealing with today. And I frankly would think that as an independent agency, somewhat akin to the Smithsonian, we would need to rebuild our scientific capacity because there are so many complex challenges out there for our parks today that having a core of scientists that are really working on these issues and providing usable knowledge to our managers would be a great addition. In the back.
Administration's executive order that allowed military veterans free access to the parks, did that impact the budget at all? And if so, is that something the Biden administration is looking to reverse?
No. Actually, I started that program as director to issue the military pass. And I got it done administratively, that all active duty, and then it's been expanded to veterans, have free access to the national parks, which we actually did the analytics on that, and it had no budgetary impact whatsoever. And we felt that it was the right thing to do, a great investment, and a great way to give back to those that have served. And it also, to me, they bring their families and they bring their kids, and bringing their kids in, getting them started in an appreciation of the outdoors and of nature and history was an investment. So we did the same thing with Every Kid in a Park Pass, which gave free access to every fourth grader in the nation, as well as all part of building a relationship to the parks. And from a fee standpoint, I've always felt that you never want to create a fee structure that actually keeps people out. The value of the park pass is, we could sell those things for $1,000 a piece. But what you really want to do is keep it low enough that the average people can afford it and can come into any, because that is, as Ken Burns said, the parks are the Declaration of Independence on the ground. And you really want them to be available to the public. And so, we've always not looked at it as a budgetary factor.
Another question from the online audience related to that. Do you have an opinion on the efficacy and future of the new reservation system that several parks are using? It seems like it has disappointed a lot of citizens who are used to ready access.
Yeah, great question. On one hand, the Park Service has been hoping to have a reservation system for a long time because it's just not a good experience to sit in your car in line for 2 hours to get into Yellowstone. And, you think about the rest of your life, you make a reservation to go to dinner. You get your tickets to a concert in advance. You have to plan around that. So why wouldn't you have to do that to go to a national park? Particularly if you want to show up in the peak season on the prettiest Sunday of the week, you're going to be in line. And so I actually, when I mentioned I was here in May in Utah and got my time ticket to get into Arches, and I actually liked it. I thought that was kind of cool. I got in line and got in on my time ticket, and at every parking lot I had a parking space, and the trails weren't jammed like they were in the past, and so it kind of worked. I would say that the online system, which is called reservation.gov, let's say needs some help. It basically is terrible. And so that is an area that could be significantly improved, where an expectation of most people today that can go online and get in a queue and learn something and make a reservation, that thing it really needs work. So if they could fix that side of it, I think generally the public will accept the system. And you don't have to run a reservation year round. I mean, as you drop into the shoulder seasons for parks, often you'll still be able to just go when you like.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. Please join me in thanking Director Jarvis again for his wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.